Chapter 6. The Art of Masoch. There is a fundamental aesthetic or plastic element in the art of Masoch. It has been said that the senses become theoreticians and that the eye, for example, becomes a human eye when its object itself has been transformed into a human or cultural object, fashioned by and intended solely for man. Animal nature is profoundly hurt when this transmutation of its organs from the animal to the human takes place, and it is the experience of this painful process that the art of Masoch aims to represent. He calls his doctrine supersensualism to indicate this cultural state of transmuted sensuality. This explains why he finds in works of art the source and the inspiration of his loves. The lover embraces a marble woman by way of initiation. Women become exciting when they are indistinguishable from cold statues in the moonlight or paintings in darkened rooms. Venus is set under the sign of Titian, with its mystical play of flesh, fur, and mirror, and the conjunction of cold, cruelty, and sentiment. The scenes in Masoch have of necessity a frozen quality, like statues or portraits. They are replicas of works of art, or else they duplicate themselves in mirrors, as when Severin catches sight of his own reflection in the mirror. Sada's heroes, by contrast, are not art lovers, still less collectors. In Juliet, Sada explains why, if only an engraver could record for posterity this divine and voluptuous scene. But lust, which all too quickly crowns our actors, might not have allowed the artist time to portray them. It is not easy for art, which is motionless, to depict an activity the essence of which is movement. Sensuality is movement. In order to convey the immediacy of this action of one soul against another, Sada chooses to rely on the quantitative techniques of accumulation and acceleration, mechanically grounded in a materialistic theory, reiteration and internal multiplication of the scenes, precipitation, overdetermination. The subject is at once parricide, incestuous, murderer, prostitute and sodomite. We have seen why number, quantity, and quantitative precipitation were the specific obsessions of sadism. Masoch, on the contrary, has every reason to rely on art and the immobile and reflective quality of culture. In his view, the plastic arts confer an eternal character on their subject because they suspend gestures and attitudes. The whip or the sword that never strikes, the fur that never discloses the flesh, the heel that is forever descending on the victim, are the expression, beyond all movement, of a profound state of waiting closer to the sources of life and death. The novels of Masoch display the most intense preoccupation with arrested movement. His scenes are frozen, as though photographed, stereotyped, or painted. In Venus it is a painter who says, "Woman, goddess, do you not know what it is to love, to be consumed by longing and passion?" And Wanda looms with her furs and her whip, adopting a suspended posture, like a tableau vivant. "I want to show you another portrait of me, one that I painted myself. You shall copy it. You shall copy it." Suggests both the sternness of the order and the reflection in the mirror. Waiting and suspense are essential characteristics of the masochistic experience. Hence the ritual scenes of hanging, crucifixion, and other forms of physical suspension in Masochist novels. The masochist is morose, but his moroseness should be related to the experience of waiting and delay. It has often been pointed out that the pleasure-pain complex is insufficient to define masochism, but humiliation, expiation, punishment, and guilt are not sufficient either. It is argued, justifiably, that the masochist is not a strange being who finds pleasure in pain, but that he is like everyone else, and finds pleasure where others do, the simple difference being that for him pain, punishment or humiliation are necessary prerequisites to obtaining gratification. However, this mechanism remains incomprehensible if it is not related to the form and in particular to the temporal form that makes it possible. Thus it is a mistake to treat the pleasure-pain complex as a raw material able intrinsically to lend itself to any transformation, beginning with the alleged transformation of sadism into masochism. Formally speaking, masochism is a state of waiting. The masochist experience is waiting in its pure form. Pure waiting divides naturally into two simultaneous currents, the first representing what is awaited, something essentially tardy, always late, and always postponed, the second representing something that is expected, and on which depends the speeding up of the awaited object. It is inevitable that such a form, such a rhythmic division of time into two streams, should be filled by the particular combination of pleasure and pain. For at the same time as pain fulfills what is expected, it becomes possible for pleasure to fulfill what is awaited. The masochist waits for pleasure as something that is bound to be late, and expects pain as the condition that will finally ensure, both physically and morally, the advent of pleasure. He therefore postpones pleasure in expectation of the pain which will make gratification possible. The anxiety of the masochist divides therefore into an indefinite awaiting of pleasure and an intense expectation of pain. Disavowal, suspense, waiting, fetishism and fantasy together make up the specific constellation of masochism. Reality, as we have seen, is affected not by negation but by a disavowal that transposes it into fantasy. Suspense performs the same function in relation to the ideal, which is also relegated to fantasy. Waiting represents the unity of the ideal and the real, the form or temporality of the fantasy. The fetish is the object of the fantasy, the fantasized object par excellence. Consider the following masochistic fantasy. A woman in shorts is pedaling energetically on a stationary bicycle. The subject is lying under the bicycle, the whirring pedals almost brushing him, his palms pressed against the woman's calves. All the elements are conjoined in this image, from the fetishism of the woman's calf to the twofold waiting represented by the motion of the pedals and the immobility of the bicycle. We should say, however, that there is no such thing as a specifically masochistic kind of waiting, but rather that the masochist is morose, by which we mean that he experiences waiting in its pure form. For example, Masoch arranged to have a healthy tooth pulled out while his wife, dressed in furs, stood before him with a threatening air. What is true of masochistic writing is equally true of masochistic fantasy. There is no specifically masochistic fantasy, but rather a masochistic art of fantasy. The masochist needs to believe that he is dreaming even when he is not. Sadism offers no such discipline in the art of the fantasy. Maurice Blanchot has given an excellent analysis of the position of Sada, and of his characters, in relation to fantasy. His own erotic dream consists in projecting the unreal dynamic of his sensuous enjoyment onto characters who are not dreaming but acting. Therefore the more this eroticism is dreamt, the more it requires a fiction from which dreams are excluded and where debauchery is fully actualized. 21 In other words, Sada needs to believe that he is not dreaming even when he is. In sadism, a powerful force of paranoid projection transforms the fantasy into the instrument of a fundamental and sudden change in the objective world. Clairwell dreams that her wickedness never ceases to impinge on the world even while she is asleep. Hence the pleasure-pain potential characteristic of the fantasy requires for its realization that real characters should experience actual pain, while pleasure accrues to the sadist inasmuch as he can continue to dream that he is not dreaming. Juliet gives the following advice: for a whole fortnight abstain from all lustful behavior, distract and entertain yourselves with other things. Then lie down in the dark and little by little imagine different wanton acts. One of these will affect you more powerfully and become like an obsession, and you must then note it down and promptly put it into action. In this way the fantasy acquires maximum aggressive power, systematization, and capacity of intervention in the real world. The idea is projected with extraordinary violence. The masochistic use of fantasy is totally different. It consists in neutralizing the real and containing the ideal within the fantasy. In our opinion, the difference in the use of the fantasy determines to a certain extent the difference in content. The sadist's destructive relation to the fetish must be interpreted in the light of his projective use of fantasy. To say that the destruction of the fetish implies a belief in the fetish, as profanation is said to imply a belief in the sacred, is to indulge in meaningless generalities. The destruction of the fetish is a measure of the speed with which projection takes place, and of the way in which the dream as such is eliminated and the idea erupts into the real waking world. By contrast, the constitution of the fetish in masochism points to the inner force of the fantasy, its characteristic of patient waiting, its suspended and static power, and the way in which the ideal and the real are together absorbed by it. It would seem that the contents of sadism and masochism are each intended to fulfill a form. Variations in the distribution of the pleasure-pain complex as well as variations in the content of the fantasy, whether the mother or the father is the determinant image, depend on the specific requirements of the form. If we take the material content as our starting point, we solve everything and we arrive besides at the supposed unity of sadism and masochism, but at the price of total confusion. Any given formula for the association of pleasure and pain must take into account certain specific formal conditions, example the form of waiting, the form of projection. Material definitions of masochism based on the pleasure-pain complex are insufficient. As the logician would say, they are purely nominal, they do not indicate the possibility of what they define, they do not show that particular conditions must follow. But worse still, they lack distinctive features, and open up the way to all sorts of confusions between sadism and masochism such as the possibility of their reversing into each other. Moral definitions based on the concepts of guilt and expiation are no better, since they are based on the alleged communication between sadism and masochism. In this sense they are even more moral than they seem. Fundamentally, masochism is neither material nor moral, but essentially formal. We need, for the understanding of the world of perversions in general, a genuinely formal, almost deductive psychoanalysis which would attend first of all to the formal patterns underlying the processes, viewed as formal elements of fictional art. In the field of formal psychoanalysis as applied to masochism, the work of Theodore Reik deserves special credit. He distinguished four basic characteristics of masochism. 1. The special significance of fantasy, that is the form of the fantasy experienced for its own sake, or the scene which is dreamed, dramatized, ritualized, and which is an indispensable element of masochism. 2. The suspense factor, the waiting, the delay, expressing the way in which anxiety affects sexual tension and inhibits its discharge. 3. The demonstrative or, more accurately, the persuasive feature, the particular way in which the masochist exhibits his suffering, embarrassment, and humiliation. 4. The provocative fear, the masochist aggressively demands punishment since it resolves anxiety and allows him to enjoy the forbidden pleasure. Point 22. It is curious that Reik, no less than other analysts, neglects a fifth factor which is very important, the form of the contract in the masochistic relationship. In Masochist's personal adventures as well as in his fiction, and in his particular case as well as in the structure of masochism in general, the contract represents the ideal form of the love relationship and its necessary precondition. A contract is drawn up between the subject and the torturess, giving a new application to the idea of the jurists of antiquity that slavery itself is based on a contract. The masochist appears to be held by real chains, but in fact he is bound by his word alone. The masochistic contract implies not only the necessity of the victim's consent, but his ability to persuade, and his pedagogical and judicial efforts to train his torturer. In the two contracts of Masoch reproduced here, see Appendix 2, it is interesting to note how the conditions alter from the first to the second contract in the direction of greater strictness. The first contract retains a degree of reciprocity of duties, a time limit, a preservation of inalienable rights, the right of work or the subject's honor. The second confers more and more rights on the woman at the expense of the subject, who loses the right to his name, his honor, and his life. Point 23, the contract in Venus changes Severin's name. The tightening of the contractual bond indicates that the function of the contract is to lay down the law, which, once established, becomes increasingly cruel and restrictive toward one of the parties, in this case the initiator of the contract. The function of the masochistic contract is to invest the mother image with the symbolic power of the law. The question remains why a contract is necessary, and why it develops as it does toward extreme severity. In any case there is no doubt that masochism cannot do without a contract, either actual or in the mind of the masochist, as in the phenomenon of pages 24. We have now seen the two aspects of the culturism of Masoch, the aesthetic aspect which is expressed in the model of art and suspense, and the juridical aspect which is expressed in the model of the contract and of submission. By contrast, Sada is not only supremely indifferent to the resources of the work of art, but he regards the contract and any appeal to its authority, or indeed any idea or theory connected with it, with the deepest hostility. The sadist heaps derision on the principle of the contract. But having said this, we should not simply oppose the culturalism of Masoch to the naturalism of Sada. Both authors exhibit a form of naturalism and both distinguish between two natures, but they do not make the same kind of distinction, and above all they have very different views on how the passage from one nature to the other is accomplished. According to Masoch, it is essentially the work of art and the contract that makes possible the transition from a lower nature to the great nature, which is sentimental and self-conscious. For Sada, on the contrary, the transition from secondary nature to primary nature implies no suspense or system of aesthetics, but an attempt to establish a mechanism of perpetual motion, and with it, institutions of perpetual motion. Sada's secret societies, his societies of libertines, are institutional societies. In a word, Sada thinks in terms of institutions, Masoch in terms of the contract. The juridical distinction between contract and institution is well known. The contract presupposes in principle the free consent of the contracting parties and determines between them a system of reciprocal rights and duties. It cannot affect a third party and is valid for a limited period. Institutions, by contrast, determine a long-term state of affairs which is both involuntary and inalienable. It establishes a power or an authority which takes effect against a third party. But even more significant is the difference between the contract and the institution with respect to what is known as a law. The contract actually generates a law, even if this law oversteps and contravenes the conditions which made it possible. The institution is of a very different order in that it tends to render laws unnecessary, to replace the system of rights and duties by a dynamic model of action, authority, and power. Saint Just accordingly demanded that there should be many institutions and few laws, and proclaimed that the republic could not be a republic so long as laws had the supremacy over institutions. 25 In short, the specific impulse underlying the contract is toward the creation of a law, even if in the end the law should take over and impose its authority upon the contract itself, whereas the corresponding impulse at work in the case of the institution is toward the degradation of all laws and the establishment of a superior power that sets itself above them. The affinity of sodists theorizing with the theme of the institution, as well as with certain aspects of Saint Just's thinking, has often been pointed out. But it is not enough to say that sodist heroes put institutions at the service of their abnormality, or need them as the limits that give full value to their transgressions. Sodist's conception of institutions is more positive and profound, and his relation to revolutionary ideology is accordingly a complex one. He rejects any contractual conception of the republican regime and is even more strongly against the idea of the law. He found in the revolution what he hated most, the law and the contract, which he regards as the two main obstacles that still prevent the French from achieving a true republic. The crux of sodist political thinking is the contrast he draws between the institution and the law, between a republic based on institutions and one based on contractual relations. Saint Just pointed out the following in verse. Relation: the fewer institutions, the greater the number of laws, as in monarchy and despotism, the fewer laws, the greater the number of institutions, the republic. Sodist seems to have developed this idea to its ironic and perhaps also its most serious conclusion. He asked which institutions would require the fewest possible laws, and ultimately no laws at all, laws so lenient and so few. Laws bind actions, they immobilize and moralize them. Pure institutions without laws would by definition be models of free, anarchic action, in perpetual motion, in permanent revolution, in a constant state of immorality. Insurrection is not a moral state of affairs, it has nevertheless to be the permanent condition in a republic. It would be both absurd and dangerous to require that those who are to ensure the perpetual subversion of the established machinery should be moral, for the state of a moral man is one of peace and tranquility, while the state of immorality is one of perpetual unrest resembling the necessary state of insurrection in which the republican must always keep the government of which he is a member. It would be a mistake to regard the famous text from Philosophy in the Bedroom, yet another effort, Frenchmen, if you wish to become republicans, merely as a paradoxical application of Sadian fantasies in the field of politics. The problem that it raises, both on the formal and on the political level, is far more serious and original. It is this: granted that both the contract and the law are in the nature of mystifications, the law being used by despotism for its own purposes, and granted that the institution is the only form of political organization that differs essentially from both law and contract, where should we look to for the perfect institution, the one that banishes contracts and allows only the barest minimum of laws? In reply, Sada points to the ironic possibility, under these conditions, of making atheism, calumny, theft, prostitution, incest and sodomy, even murder, into institutions, and shows furthermore that they are necessarily the types of the ideal institution, the institution in perpetual motion. He stresses in particular the possibility of instituting universal prostitution, and he attempts to refute the contractual objection to such universalization. In any case, those who contrast Sada's extreme theoretical pronouncements with his very moderate personal stand during the revolution fail to do justice to his political thought. The opposition that he established between the institution and the contract and its corollary, the opposition between institutions and laws, have become juridical platitudes of positivist thinking. But this is because their original significance and their revolutionary character have been obscured by uneasy compromises. If we wish to recover the original meaning of these oppositions and of the choices and directions they imply, we must return to Sada, and to Saint Just, who does not give quite the same answers as Sada. There is a profound political insight in Sada's conception of the revolutionary republic as an institution based on opposition to both law and contract, but this conception is ironic through and through because it is sexual and sexualized, as if deliberately to challenge any attempt to think of politics in legalistic or contractual terms. We should expect to find in Mazok a comparable tour de force, the humorous converse of Sada's. As against the latter's ironic conception of the institution based on the rejection of law and contract, and in the context of the revolution of 1789, we have to consider the humorous contribution of Mazok and his conception of the relationship between the contract and the law, in the context of the 1848 revolution. As a result, fundamental problems of rights begin to emerge in their true light even as they become perverted in the work of Sada and Mazok and turned into literary elements in a parody of the philosophy of history.